Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. You ready to jump into some Cold War history?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so today we're going to be looking at Canada's role during the Cold War. And I was doing some research for this episode based on an ID History podcast episode that goes into a lot of detail about this. And honestly, some of the things I learned were pretty surprising.
Yeah, I think it's an area that is often overlooked. You know, we tend to focus on that U.S.-Soviet rivalry, and everything else gets kind of pushed to the side a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And, you think of, like, Canada being this, peace-loving country up north.
Yeah.
But some of the things I learned were, like, kind of shocking. Like, for example, did you know that before World War II, Canada was basically isolationist?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, they were very hesitant to get involved in global affairs.
Right.
They kind of wanted to keep to themselves.
Yeah, but then after World War II, they become like a founding member of NATO.
Yeah.
That's a huge shift. Like how?
It is a big shift. Yeah, and I think World War II was a real turning point for a lot of countries.
Okay.
You've got to remember the world was in chaos, devastation everywhere. And then you have this looming threat of the Soviet Union.
Right. Yeah, so it's like, okay, we can't just sit on the sidelines anymore.
Exactly. It was a wake-up call. And for Canada, it was a wake-up call to really rethink their role in the world. They realized that isolationism wasn't going to cut it anymore.
Right.
They needed to be more proactive in ensuring that own security and the security of the Western world. And this is where we start to see the influence of some key figures, particularly Prime Minister Louis St. Laurent and his Foreign Minister Lester B. Pearson.
Okay, Pearson. That name rings a bell.
Yeah, he's a big deal. He's kind of considered the architect of what we call Pearsonian internationalism.
Okay, so fill me in, like, who is this guy and what is Pearsonian internationalism?
Well, Pearson was all about multilateralism, working together with other nations to solve global problems. He was a firm believer in collective security, which basically means countries banding together to protect each other. And he was a huge advocate for international cooperation.
So not just like military alliances, but also like working together to make the world a better place.
Exactly. He saw that as essential for lasting peace. You can't just focus on military strength. You need strong democracies, economic stability, all of these things working together.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So how does this all tie into Canada joining NATO? Because that seems like a pretty big jump, going from isolationism to joining a military alliance.
Well, it might seem like a big jump, but when you consider the context of the early Cold War, it starts to make sense.
Okay.
Remember, the Soviet Union's influence is spreading across Eastern Europe.
Right.
The Western democracies are getting nervous, and the U.S. is already implementing containment policies like the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe and the Truman Doctrine to support countries resisting communism.
So the stakes are getting higher.
Exactly. And Pearson sees a united front as absolutely essential to counter the Soviet threat and prevent another devastating war. He also sees NATO as a way to prevent infighting among the Western European powers.
Right, because they had a bit of a history of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you need to keep everyone on the same page. United we stand, divided we fall, kind of thing.
Makes sense. So a unified alliance means strength in numbers and a stronger deterrent against Soviet aggression.
Right. And what's really interesting is that Canada's influence on NATO goes beyond just joining the alliance.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they actually played a key role in shaping its identity.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
Tell me more. Well, there's this thing called Article 2 of the NATO Treaty, sometimes nicknamed the Canadian Article.
The Canadian Article. I like it already. So what's so special about this article?
Well, it reflects Pearson's vision for a world that was about more than just military might.
Okay.
Article 2 goes beyond those traditional military commitments of an alliance. It focuses on promoting free political institutions and encouraging economic cooperation among member states.
So they're basically saying, yeah, military strength is important, but if we really want lasting peace, we need to build strong democracies and help each other thrive economically.
Exactly. It's about addressing the root causes of conflict and creating a more stable and prosperous world.
Right. And that was like a pretty radical idea for the time, wasn't it?
It was. And it shows that Canada was thinking long-term about how to prevent future conflicts. They weren't just focused on the immediate threat. They were looking at the bigger picture.
Right. So it kind of challenges that idea that smaller nations can't really make a difference on the world stage.
Oh, for sure. Canada really proves that wrong.
Okay. So we've got Canada joining NATO, pushing for a more peaceful and cooperative world through this Article 2. But you mentioned earlier that geography also played a big role in Canada's Cold War experience.
Oh, absolutely. Geography is everything in geopolitics, as they say.
Yeah, and especially when you're sandwiched between two superpowers like Canada was.
Exactly. You've got Canada right between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, especially in that Arctic region, which became increasingly strategic during the Cold War.
Right, so Canada's basically on the front lines.
In a way, yeah. And this geographic reality had a huge impact on Canada's defense priorities and their relationship with the U.S.
Okay, so how did that play out?
Well, think about it. Contested airspace, potential missile trajectories over Canadian territory.
Right.
Canada's location made them a crucial partner for the U.S.
Yeah.
in monitoring and responding to potential Soviet threats. And this is where NORAD comes in.
NORAD. I remember seeing those maps with the radar lines and the fighter jets on alert.
Yeah, very iconic imagery from the Cold War.
It really captures that whole tension of the time.
It does. So NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, was established in 1957.
Okay.
And it was all about joint monitoring and response to potential Soviet threats from the air. It was a true partnership between Canada and the U.S., with both countries sharing responsibility for defending North American airspace.
So Canada wasn't just like a passive bystander. They were an active participant in this crucial aspect of Cold War defense.
Absolutely. They contributed personnel resources, expertise to NORAD. Their early warning radar stations stretching across the Canadian Arctic were crucial for detecting potential Soviet bombers or missiles.
Right.
And Canadian fighter pilots were right there alongside their American counterparts, ready to scramble and intercept any threats.
Wow, so they were really in the thick of it.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how intertwined Canada and the U.S. became during this period.
Right. It's incredible to think about the level of cooperation and trust that must have existed between the two countries.
It is, especially when you consider that they sometimes had very different approaches to foreign policy, as we saw with the Suez crisis.
Right. So it's like this complex relationship with moments of tension, but also this underlying sense of partnership and shared purpose.
You got it. It's a fascinating dynamic, and one that we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into Canada's Cold War experience.
Okay, so we've got Canada joining NATO, pushing for a more peaceful and cooperative world, through Article 2, working closely with the U.S. on air defense, through NORAD. It sounds like they were pretty firmly planted in the Western camp.
Yeah, you could say that, but
Yeah.
it wasn't always so straightforward.
Oh, really?
Yeah, while Canada was staunchly anti-communist and a close ally of the U.S., they also had their own distinct approach to foreign policy. And sometimes that led them to take a different path.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff.
Right.
Give me an example.
Okay, well, one of the most dramatic examples is the 1956 Suez crisis.
The Suez Canal.
Yeah, that's the one. This was a complex situation involving Egypt, Israel, France, and Britain, with the U.S. and the Soviet Union also kind of lurking in the background. It was a real powder keg that could have ignited a much larger conflict.
Okay, so remind me what was going on there and how did Canada get involved?
All right, so the Suez Canal was this vital waterway for global trade.
Right.
And the crisis erupted when Egypt nationalized it, basically taking control from the British and French.
Yeah.
Britain, France, and Israel responded militarily. And suddenly you have this incredibly tense standoff with the potential to spiral out of control.
Yikes. So what did Canada do?
Well, Canada steps in and plays a crucial role in de-escalating the situation.
Okay.
And this is where Lester Pearson really shines.
All right, Mr. Pearsonian internationalism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was Canada's Minister of External Affairs at the time and a strong believer in diplomacy. He saw the danger of the Suez crisis escalating into a larger war and was determined to find a peaceful solution.
So he was like, we need to find a way out of this mess before things get really bad.
Pretty much. And that's exactly what he did. He proposed the creation of a UN peacekeeping force to stabilize the region.
A UN peacekeeping force.
Yeah, that was his big idea. And it was initially met with resistance, especially from the U.S.
Wait, the U.S. resisted the idea of a UN peacekeeping force?
Mhm.
That seems odd considering they were all about containing the Soviet Union.
Yeah. It might seem counterintuitive, but at that time, the U.S., under President Eisenhower, had their own plans for the region and were wary of anything that might strengthen the Soviet Union's influence.
So even close allies can have some pretty significant disagreements, especially when it comes to global hotspots like the Suez Canal.
Oh, absolutely. It's a reminder that alliances don't always mean seeing eye to eye on everything. Countries bring their own perspectives, their own priorities, their own approaches to the table, and sometimes those clash.
Okay, But in the end, did Canada's peacekeeping proposal succeed?
It did. Despite the initial resistance, Pearson's diplomacy won over the international community.
Wow.
The UN peacekeeping force was deployed and played a key role in de-escalating the Suez crisis, preventing a wider war, and paving the way for a peaceful resolution.
That's a pretty impressive achievement for Canada, especially considering they were going up against the U.S.'s preferred approach.
It was. It was a defining moment for Canada on the world stage.
Yeah.
And it earned Lester Pearson the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957, solidifying his legacy as a champion of diplomacy and peacemaking.
Wow, so he really made his mark on history.
He did. The Suez Crisis also highlights Canada's willingness to chart its own course in foreign policy, even if it meant disagreeing with their most powerful ally.
It's like they were walking this tightrope during the Cold War, balancing a close alliance with the U.S., while also maintaining their own independence and pursuing their own vision for a more peaceful world.
Exactly. And this balancing act had a lasting impact on Canada's relationship with the U.S., both during the Cold War and in the decades that followed. It's a complex and fascinating dynamic that we'll continue to unpack in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so just to recap, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored Canada's dramatic shift from isolationism to global player, their motivations for joining NATO, their unique contributions like Article 2, their strategic importance due to their geography, and their willingness to stand up for their own principles, even when it meant disagreeing with the U.S.
Yeah, we've barely scratched the surface.
Look, I know, there's still so much more to unpack.
Yeah. Indeed. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into how Canada navigated the Cold War's twists and turns, exploring key events like the Gouzenko affair.
The Gouzenko affair.
Oh yeah, a real-life spy thriller.
I'm already hooked.
And of course, we'll continue to examine their complex relationship with the U.S.
This is getting good. I can't wait to dive back and see it. Stay tuned because it's about to get even more interesting.
You got it.
All right, see you next time.
See you later.
All right, so welcome back to our deep dive into Canada during the Cold War. And last time we were talking about how Canada wasn't afraid to make their own decisions, even if it meant sometimes going against what the U.S. wanted.
Right, they weren't just going to blindly follow the U.S.'s lead. They had their own ideas about how to approach global affairs.
Yeah, and the Suez crisis was a great example of that.
Oh, definitely. Canada really stepped up and showed the world what they were capable of. You know, they championed diplomacy and multilateralism when things could have very easily escalated into a much bigger conflict.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. This middle power from the North playing such a big role in diffusing this global crisis.
Yeah.
It really shows that you don't have to be a superpower to shape world events.
Absolutely. And I think Canada's actions during the Suez crisis really helped to solidify their reputation on the world stage. You know, they showed that they were a country that could be trusted to be a mediator and to find peaceful solutions to complex problems.
Yeah, and it also had a lasting impact on the development of UN peacekeeping, right? Like that was a pretty new concept at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Canada really helped to pioneer the idea of UN peacekeeping. And today it's become one of the most important tools we have for preventing and resolving conflicts around the world.
So pretty significant legacy for Canada.
Definitely. Okay, so moving on, I know we also wanted to talk about something called the Gouzenko affair.
The Gouzenko affair?
Yeah.
What was that all about? It sounds kind of mysterious.
Oh, it's a wild story.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So picture this. It's 1945, World War II has just ended, and the world is kind of entering this new era of tension with the Soviet Union.
Right, the Cold War is starting to heat up.
Exactly. And then suddenly a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Gouzenko walks out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa and defects.
Wait, he defected? Like he just decided to leave the Soviet Union and seek asylum in Canada?
Yep, just like that. He had had enough. And the crazy thing is he brought with him a ton of documents that revealed this massive Soviet espionage network that was operating not just in Canada, but all over the Western world.
Hold on, a Soviet spy ring operating in Canada.
Oh, yeah. And not just Canada. The U.S., the U.K., other Western countries.
Yeah.
It was a huge wake-up call for the West. You know, they had suspected that the Soviets were engaged in espionage, but they had no idea how extensive it really was.
So what kind of stuff was in these documents? Like, what were the Soviets trying to do?
Well, according to the documents, they were trying to steal nuclear secrets, infiltrate Western governments, undermine democratic institutions. It was a whole range of activities designed to weaken the West and advance Soviet interests.
It's like something out of a spy movie.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Except this was real life.
So what was the impact of all this? Like, how did the Gouzenko affair change things?
Well, it was a major turning point in the Cold War. I mean, it confirmed a lot of the West's fears about Soviet intentions, and it really ramped up the paranoia and suspicion on both sides.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that would happen.
And for Canada specifically, it had a profound impact on their perception of the Soviet threat. They went from being somewhat hesitant to get involved in global affairs to being fully committed to the Western alliance.
Right. So the Guzenko affair basically pushed them further into the U.S.'s camp.
You could say that it definitely strengthened their resolve to stand up to the Soviet Union and to work with their allies to contain communism.
It's interesting how one event like that can have such a ripple effect.
Yeah, it just goes to show that history is full of these unexpected twists and turns, and you never know when some seemingly isolated incident is going to end up shaping the course of global politics.
Okay, so we've got the Suez crisis showcasing Canada's commitment to diplomacy and multilateralism. And then we have the Guzenko affair, which reveals this whole hidden world of espionage and really intensifies the Cold War rivalry. Now, I know we also wanted to talk about Canada's geography and how that played a role in their Cold War experience.
Oh, yeah. Geography is always a key factor in international relations. And in Canada's case, it was particularly important during the Cold War.
Right, because they're literally right between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Exactly, especially in the Arctic region, which became increasingly strategic as the Cold War went on.
So Canada was basically on the front lines of this ideological battle.
In a way, yeah. And that meant that they had to be very mindful of their security and their defense priorities.
Okay, so how did that play out in terms of their relationship with the U.S.?
Well, for one thing, it led to the creation of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command.
Right, NORAD. Those Cold War maps with the radar lines and the fighter jets always look so intense.
I know, it really captures that whole Cold War vibe of constant vigilance and the threat of nuclear war.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, it was a pretty tense time. But anyway, NORAD was all about joint monitoring and response to potential Soviet threats from the air. So basically, Canada and the U.S. were working together to defend North American airspace.
So Canada was playing a pretty active role in this.
Oh, absolutely. They were a vital partner in NORAD. They contributed personnel resources, expertise to the organization. They had all those early warning radar stations stretching across the Canadian Arctic, which were essential for detecting potential Soviet bombers or missiles.
Wow, so Canada was really on the front lines in more ways than one.
They were, and they were also right there alongside the U.S. when it came to actually intercepting those threats. Canadian fighter pilots were trained and equipped to scramble and engage Soviet aircraft if necessary.
It's amazing to think about the level of cooperation and coordination that must have gone into all of that.
It's a testament to the strong relationship between Canada and the U.S. Despite their differences, they were able to come together and work effectively to protect their shared interests.
So it's like this kind of paradoxical relationship, right? They're close allies, but they also have their own independent views, and they're not afraid to disagree with each other.
Exactly. It's a complex dynamic, but ultimately, I think it's a healthy one. It shows that they respect each other's perspectives and that they're willing to work through their differences to achieve common goals.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways we should keep in mind?
Well, I think we've seen that Canada played a much more active and influential role in the Cold War than many people realize. They weren't just following the U.S.'s lead. They were making their own decisions, shaping events, and contributing to global security in meaningful ways.
Yeah, they definitely weren't just sitting on the sidelines.
And I think we've also seen that Canada's relationship with the U.S. during this period was complex and nuanced. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but ultimately their shared values and their commitment to democracy and freedom helped to bind them together.
Right, so it's a story of cooperation, but also of independence and sometimes even disagreement.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even the closest of allies can have their differences, and that's okay. As long as there's mutual respect and a willingness to work through those differences, then the relationship can actually become stronger as a result.
All right, well said. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how this complex relationship between Canada and the U.S. continued to evolve after the Cold War ended, and how the lessons they learned during that era continue to shape their interactions today. So stay tuned for more fascinating insights into this often overlooked chapter of history.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Canada's Cold War experience. It's been quite the journey so far.
It has, hasn't it?
We've seen Canada go from isolationism to becoming a founding member of NATO and a key player in NORAD.
Right. And they really made their mark on the world stage.
Yeah, like during the Suez crisis when they championed diplomacy and helped to prevent a larger conflict.
And then there was the Guzenko affair, which exposed that whole Soviet spy network operating in Canada.
It's been a wild ride, for sure.
Yeah, lots of twists and turns.
Speaking of twists and turns, one thing that's been coming up a lot is this idea of Canada being a close ally of the U.S., but also having their own independent streak.
Hmm.
They weren't afraid to disagree with the U.S. when it came to certain issues.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about their relationship. It wasn't just a simple case of Canada following the U.S.'s lead. They had their own ideas about how to approach global affairs, and they weren't afraid to stand up for what they believed in.
So how did that affect their long-term relationship? Like, did those disagreements create lasting friction between the two countries?
Well, it definitely added some complexity to the relationship. The U.S. being the dominant power wasn't always thrilled when Canada went their own way.
Right, I can imagine.
But I think over time, this dynamic actually strengthened the bond between them.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, it showed that Canada was a reliable partner to not just a follower. They were willing to speak their minds and to challenge the U.S. when they felt it was necessary.
So it's like they earned the U.S.'s respect by being willing to stand up to them.
Exactly. And I think that ultimately made their alliance even stronger because it was based on mutual respect and a recognition that both countries brought something valuable to the table.
That's interesting. So they weren't afraid to disagree, but they were also able to work together effectively when it really mattered.
Right. And I think that's a really important lesson for any kind of relationship, whether it's between countries or between individuals. It's okay to have different opinions as long as you're able to communicate openly and respectfully and to find common ground when you need to.
So did this pattern of cooperation and disagreement continue after the Cold War ended?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the Cold War might be over, but Canada and the U.S. still face a lot of the same challenges, global terrorism, climate change, economic instability.
Right.
And they still need to work together to address those challenges. But Canada continues to chart its own course on certain issues. They have their own unique perspective on things, and they're not afraid to take a different approach than the U.S. if they think it's the right thing to do.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. Well, one example is climate change.
Yeah.
Canada has been a lot more proactive than the U.S. in terms of implementing policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay.
Another example is international trade.
Wow.
Canada has been a strong advocate for free trade, but they've also been willing to stand up to the U.S. when they feel that American trade policies are unfair.
Interesting. So they're still walking that tightrope.
Yeah, they are, but I think they're doing a pretty good job of it.
Right.
They're maintaining a strong relationship with the U.S. while also staying true to their own values and principles.
So what's the big takeaway here? Like, what can we learn from Canada's Cold War experience?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that smaller countries can have a real impact on world events. They don't have to be a superpower to make a difference.
Right.
And I think Canada's story really shows that it's a story of courage and determination, of standing up for what you believe in, even when it's difficult, and of finding ways to work with others to build a better world.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
And it's a story that's still unfolding today.
Exactly. Canada continues to play an important role on the world stage, and they continue to be a valuable partner and ally to the U.S., but they're also their own country with their own unique perspective, and I think that's something to be celebrated.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Canada's Cold War experience, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that history is full of surprises. When we dig beneath the surface, we often find stories that challenge our assumptions and offer new perspectives. And I think Canada's Cold War experience is a perfect example of that.
It really is. It's a story that's full of twists and turns and unexpected outcomes.
Exactly. And it's a story that's still relevant today. The lessons we learned from the Cold War can help us to understand the challenges we face in the 21st century and to find new ways to work together to build a more peaceful and prosperous world.
Well said. It's been an incredible journey exploring this often overlooked chapter of history. And I hope our listeners have gained a new appreciation for Canada's complex and fascinating role during the Cold War.
Me too. And remember, as we analyze history, it's crucial to consider multiple perspectives and recognize the nuances that shape events. There's always more to uncover, more to understand, and more to learn from the past.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of history. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Sounds good. See you later.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.